dogs and dogettes. I hope your first week of cyber school is going great. I know it's not easy and it's a challenge, but it's a good thing for us to experience. The circumstances aren't great, but there are going to be a lot of times in life that things don't go as smoothly as what you expect or what you'd really like for them to go. And life's really just about how you deal with valleys. It's not all about hills. And so it's a good experience for all of us, teachers included, to be going through this. We're going to dig right into our English lesson and what we're going to be discussing in our chapter, or for 7th and 8th grade, actually it's our chapters on agreement. What we're going to be dealing with today are certain nouns that can be problematic, but we don't want to let them be that as we try to identify what the subject of a sentence is, and as well what the proper verb is that goes along with it. This isn't going to be a very long lesson. You guys have done a good job and you put up with a lot of Mr. Derek's gabbing, and so this is going to be even a shorter lesson. I think I told you yesterday it was going to be short. Well, this one's even getting whittled down some from what the original ones are. We front-loaded the first part of the chapter, and so the back end won't be quite as difficult. So some problem nouns as subjects. Let's look at some nouns of plural form. Now, I'll just tell you this up front. And you have a handy-dandy chart in your books, and again, it's going to be different pages for each one of your grades. But look that up under this section, problem nouns as subjects, and you're going to have a chart in which it's listed that there are a whole bunch of nouns, and it's not an exhaustive list, okay? But there are a whole bunch of nouns, and they're all in plural form, meaning they look plural, and some are going to be treated as plurals. But some of those that appear to be plural are going to be treated as singular nouns as well. And there's not really, just to be truthful, a great rhyme or reason to it. But it's just one of those things that kind of is what it is. And you just have to learn how, when you come across that certain one, just recognize it. Okay, that's just the way it is. There's no great rule that corresponds with it. So let's look at number one, nouns of plural form. How about the game checkers? I think we've talked about that game some. I love checkers. Checkers is a lot of fun. Not a big fan of chess, but I do like checkers, and chess is okay too. Checkers is or are a cognitive, meaning a thinking game. Which one? Is it that checkers is or checkers are a cognitive game? Well, you can just kind of hear it in the way you say it, can't you? Obviously, with checkers being the subject, is a singular verb is going to fit, and that's because this noun that appears in plural form is actually used in a singular way. A checker is singular, but checkers, meaning multiples of the pieces, is plural, and that's the name of the game. Multiple pieces, making it plural. It's a plural form, but it's used in a singular way. And again, it's not really a rule, it's just something with which we have to be familiar. All right, how about number two? My walking shoes. All right, and I'm going to underline singularly in each one the subject of the sentence and twice the verb. But my walking shoes, obviously shoes is the subject of the sentence, correct? Is it that my walking shoes is dirty, or my walking shoes are dirty? Well, there's one that sounds right and obviously has to be that way, and it's the plural form. Well, that makes sense. It's a plural form noun anyway, and so we would use a plural form verb, but not just because it's in plural form, because checkers is in plural form too. It's just the way we do it. We're English speakers, and we don't always have rules for everything that we do. But shoes is going to be used in a plural way. And you might say, well, yeah, of course, why wouldn't it? Well, shoes are often being considered not so much for their individuality, but really in reference to a pair, and pair is singular, even though it involves more than one thing. But pair is a singular noun, and you might be referring to a pair of shoes, even though you don't use the wording a pair. But regardless, you're always going to use the plural verb form whenever you use shoes. How about whenever you refer to sports teams? The Kansas City, I didn't have room for the city, but the Kansas City Chiefs, would I say is or are my favorite team. The Chiefs is my favorite team, or the Chiefs are my favorite team. Obviously, the subject is Chiefs, but the way we say that, and correctly so, as the verb is are. The Chiefs are my favorite team, plural. Well, we might look at it and say, well, of course it's a plural verb because it's a plural noun. Yeah, it does have a plural form. But when you're referring to the Chiefs as the predicate noun renames, really you're only talking about a singular entity, a single team, and yet you use a plural verb form. And so you see there are really kind of arguments that can be made on either side of these, but there's technically an official way of doing it and a not so official and an incorrect way of doing it. And of course we want to do it the correct way regardless of whether there's a beautiful rule in English for it or not. Alright, let's do one more of these and we'll move on. Well, what about if you're considering a subject in school? Say, for instance, mathematics. And we usually shorten that just to math, but the fullness of it is mathematics. Would you say mathematics is or are my best subject? The subject being mathematics, double usage of the word there. Mathematics, the subject, would you say is or are my best subject? Well, it doesn't make any sense to say are my best subject. You would say is, and the reason for that is really you're referring only to a single subject, even though it's a plural form, meaning having a word with an S on the end. Again, I wish I could tell you there's a rhyme and there's a reason to this, but English is just a language that there isn't as much systematic usage and breakdowns and rules like you're learning in Spanish, by the way. It's a pretty systematic language. There are a lot more concrete answers in it to what there are in English, and really that's true almost with any language compared to English, but just is what it is. So look at that chart. I'm just giving you a few examples of it. Look at that chart under this section. Problem nouns as subjects and something along those lines as a subheading. Nouns of plural form, and just be familiar with those. Like I've told you in another thing or two, guys, I don't care really. I would love it, in fact, if you'd want to take that chart and copy it down to your notes. I don't have room to put it here on the board, but feel free to copy that down to your notes, and I'm really okay with your doing that and even getting to use it then later on the test. I'd like for you to do that. That'd be super. Now, collective nouns. They're a little bit different than nouns of plural form. Nouns of plural form, even though they're all in plural form, can be used only as singular nouns or only as plural nouns, and you won't find them used any other way. Collective nouns are different, and even though they might be in a, well, I don't know if you'd make the case plural or singular form. I would probably tend more to argue singular on these, but collective nouns, they can be used, here's what's really important, they can be used either in a singular or a plural way, and you have to use the context to determine whether you employ a singular or a plural verb to correctly correspond back to the subject. For instance, number one, the team, obviously team is going to be the subject of the sentence, even though we haven't read it yet, and that's probably a poor practice, bad habit I'm teaching you. I'm jumping ahead just a little, but team is going to be the subject of the sentence. The team, would you say, expect or expects to repeat? The team expect or the team expects to repeat? Well, you're talking about the team as a single entity, and therefore you would use a singular verb, which is one often with an S on the end of it. Remember the opposite of a noun, a singular noun. You would use the singular verb to refer to that singular entity. But look at number two. I'm using the same word, guys, as the subject of the sentence. The team is or are giving, here's your key word, their, which is a plural possessive pronoun, speeches. The team is or are giving their speeches. Well, because I have a possessive plural pronoun being used, it's obvious the context in which I'm using the word team is to refer to probably the players and or perhaps the coaches on that team. And the reason for that, using that plural possessive pronoun, I'm going to have to as well use a plural verb. I'm going to tell you right now, I hate this. I wish it didn't exist in the English language. Guys, I'm a nobody when it comes to English, but I disagree with the English language. But the reason for that is I love systems, and I love rules on which you can count. And to me, it's just a violation to have what really of itself is a singular word, and then to use it in this capacity. Here's what I would really encourage you guys to do to avoid awkward wording, and no one can disagree with this. Instead of saying the team are giving their speeches and say, well, I'm referring to the players on the team, and technically that's correct to do so in English. Yeah, that's true. But I would rather read less awkwardly, and I would word it, if I were you, and this is what I try to do myself, say something like the players on the team are giving their speeches, or the coaches on the team are giving their speeches, or even the players and the coaches of the team are giving their speeches. And to me, that makes it where it flows a little bit better. Number 3, the crowd is or are fighting among themselves. Now the main verb here is not is or are, that's a helping verb. The main verb is fighting. And so I'm going to go ahead and double underline fighting. Obviously, crowd is the subject of the sentence. So the crowd, what helping verb should I use with fighting? Is or are fighting among themselves. Well, crowd really is a singular term of itself. Technically, it's a collective one. There are many within it, but it's a singular word of itself. But if you'll look, you'll notice this prepositional phrase at the end that changes the whole paradigm. Among themselves. That third person plural pronoun makes crowd a plurality that is under consideration. And because of that, I must utilize a plural helping verb. The crowd are fighting because of this prepositional phrase, among, this word being key, themselves, plural pronoun. And so that's why, again, I don't like that. What I would encourage you to do, what I try to do myself, is if I'm referring to the people in the crowd, I would rather articulate that, and so it comes across clear in my speaking or my writing. And so I would say the people in the crowd are fighting among themselves. And you see how that sounds better, and it would read better coming off of a paper. Number 4, would you say the crowd is or are growing? The crowd is or are growing. Well, in looking at it, obviously crowd is the subject, okay? And what would you choose as the verb? Because that's a singular word that's typically used in that way, I would choose the verb is. And the reason for that is I have nothing afterward that would insinuate that I should go against the way that it's typically used, which is in a singular fashion. And so in this instance, it would be the crowd not are growing, but the crowd as a collective singular unit is growing. So these aren't always easy, neither are these, but at least they're always one way, singular or plural. These are both singular and at other times and in different ways, plural. What about titles, quotations, and amounts? Numbers 1 and 2 deal with titles, and both of those are titles of books. I contemplated for our class actually reading this book, having to do with the setting in the Civil War. We ended up going a different route, but that would have been a possibility. Little Women, have you ever read that book? Little Women, would you say is or are a classic story? Now what's to me kind of cool about it, I do like these. I think these are fun. Women is plural. And so you might think, well, you got to have a plural verb. But how is Little Women being considered. And notice how I didn't say how are Little Women, but the correct way of asking that is how is Little Women underlined as a book, a single entity? How's it being considered? Well, the predicate nominative, you can't always trust in this, as we discussed yesterday, but the predicate nominative renames that as a single story, or we would understand it as a single book. And because of that, it's underlined, and that's not, the underline of a subject, but you do that with a book. Remember, you can put it in italics or underline. Well, it's hard to freehand italics, and so it's underlined here. I'm going to go ahead and singular underline that book as the subject, the whole thing, okay? Little Women, and it's singular in the way it's being considered. A solitary unit is, not are, it is a classic story. Similarly, we did read this book earlier in the year. I really liked that book. Did you? Number the Stars. And if you'll notice, stars, that comes right before the verb. This whole thing, though, is going to be our subject. And I had it underlined because it's a book, and that's the way you show respect and or set it apart from the rest of the sentence. But number the stars as the subject. If you'll notice, the last word in the subject, it's not the subject standalone, but it's a part of the subject, is plural. But it is being considered as a single entity, just like Little Women above it. Number the Stars is or are a book we had to read. Number the Stars are not a book we had to read. Kind of helps to say it that way, doesn't it? Number the Stars is a book we had to read because it's being contemplated, again, just as one compiled account. Number 3, calisthenics, and we're going to deal with quotations of numbers 3 and 4. Calisthenics, that is a hard word to say. Trust me, it's a harder word to spell. I looked it up and made sure, and I wasn't correct the first time. But calisthenics, I remember hearing it more, it seems like in elementary school for whatever reason. But it's basically, it's not necessarily limited to, but it's basically PE or the like. The calisthenics, would you say, is or are a difficult word to spell? Well, look, the word itself is in plural form. It has an S at the end of it. But that predicate nominative does kind of help in this case. And again, yesterday, don't forget, it can throw you off too. But in this case, it does help. You wouldn't say calisthenics are a difficult word, but you would say that calisthenics, single underline for the subject, is a difficult word to spell. I like this one. I don't know if your parents probably aren't going to watch this, but number 4, you can probably relate to it, and I bet they can too. And notice the quotation marks, I have told you 1,000 times, in quotation, is or are my parents' favorite line. I have told you 1,000 times. Now, really, I don't know that I would call this the subject of the sentence, although maybe. These are tough. I would maybe call line the subject of the sentence. With a predicate nominative, sometimes it's difficult, flipping the sentence and where you'd have it. But whether it's line or I've told you 1,000 times, it really doesn't make a big difference. Let's just say, and not debate it at this point, that I have told you 1,000 times is being used as a big, long, collective subject as a quotation. And if you'll see, 1,000 times comes right before the verb. And you might think, well, that's plural. This has to be a plural verb, are. But would you say my parents' favorite line are, I have told you? No. You would say my parents' favorite line is, I have told you 1,000 times to clean your room. I have told you 1,000 times to do your chores. We could pick quite a few here. They've told us 1,000 times to do a lot of different things, right? But that of itself is being considered as a singular entity and not the 1,000 times separated. Number 5 is a super duper tricky one. 2 cups of chocolate chips is or are needed for the cookies. Remember what I told you about identifying prepositional phrases, if I can spit it out, phrases, and how that can help you to find what the subject of the sentence is? Well, we have this prepositional phrase, of chocolate chip cookies, therefore the subject cannot be ever in a prepositional phrase, nor can be a verb, but a verb wouldn't be in a prepositional phrase anyway. So the subject has to be what would normally we would think be cups, and to would be an adjective for cups. But here's the thing about this that makes it a little strange. Really, I think you can make the argument that 2 cups goes together, and the reason for that is it's a single ingredient within a recipe. And so again, you can make the argument that I'm looking at 2 cups as one entity, and that's going to be key as to identifying the verb here. We would typically say 2 cups are needed for the cookies, but here's a tricky thing about the English language. When something that really is a plural form, don't forget, is being considered as a single unit, I hate this, guys. This is, I don't even want to write it on the board. I think this is wrong to the degree of being sinful. It should not be this way, but it is what it is. Okay, the English language is constructed in such a way so as to argue that 2 cups of chocolate chips is needed for the cookies because they're being seen as a single ingredient. I know it doesn't sound right, I know it doesn't look right, I know it violates everything that's good about American English speaking. However, there you go. This one, I think, number 6, though, helps to explain number 5 a little bit better, and that's why I want to move on to it. $5 is or are the cost of each ticket. Just like before, ordinarily we might say dollars is the subject and 5 is an adjective that modifies or describes that noun. However, this is a little bit unique in that $5 is being considered as a single entity as the subject of the sentence. And as that, would you say $5 are the cost? Look, dollars is plural. For that matter, 5 is more than 1. But $5, dollars, normally you would say are, but in this case, would you say, just think about the way it sounds. Would you say $5 are the cost of each ticket? That doesn't even make sense, does it, when you say it that way? And that's why we say, even though it's in a plural form, we use a singular verb to express $5 is the cost of each ticket. Now that one does make a little bit more sense, doesn't it? And if so, you can look back at 5 and you can see the same principle that that's at work. As we would say $5 is the cost, it's the same concept with 2 cups of chocolate chips is needed. So does that sound a little bit better? Does that make more sense? Maybe you're like I am and you don't like and you hate it, or maybe you're better than I am and you're okay with that and you're obsessed with the English language. Actually, I am. I love the English language. It's just at times little things like that, slight nuances do frustrate me some. But that's it, guys. That's not bad, huh? That's a lot shorter lesson. And so that's what we have as problem nouns, as subjects. Finding agreement with our verbs is not always easy, but it is doable. There's not always a rhyme or a reason, but there is a technically correct and a wrong way of doing these things. And there you have it.